So, the subject I want to speak to you about today, and I mentioned this when I spoke in October. There's these three words, children of God. And the scripture I'm taking this from, is because, of course, Matthew 18:13, that we're invited to be as children in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. I can't imagine there's anyone in the room that hasn't heard that before. That's rather why I wanted to go there. Rather like, if we're going to have a subject of love, there's quite a bit to explore. And the essence of the children of God, in terms of the scripture and the biblical reference, it's so over-referenced and so underexplored. You know, I've driven here. Well, probably don't need these anyway. Probably don't need that. I drove here from Fort Lauderdale yesterday, and I'm sure you've done that drive, and you know, oh, for the love of God, here we go. I'm just going to put that there, see how I get on, right? So I drove from Fort Lauderdale, and you know that drive from there to here, and you see the sun reflecting off the water, and it's just absolutely glorious, isn't it? I even got here quite early, and the sun was quite red, reflecting off the water, just delightful. And you know, you look at that, but some of you, I'm sure, you've jumped off a boat into the ocean, haven't you? And it's a wildly different experience being in there as opposed to on the boat. You go from hot to cold, you go from light to dark. And all of a sudden you're in this big expanse that goes on and on and on forever, it seems. And such is the case with expressions like children of God, with expressions like the Christ consciousness. You know how easily that rolls off the tongue? Compared to what the Christ consciousness actually must be, because I can't pretend to know what that truly is. Kingdom of heaven, that little thing right there, you know, is what we come to explore. And so we're invited to be as children. And so I figure, well, what a good place to start other than looking at children. I have three. I'm rather well versed in this subject. My eldest, Sophia, you know, I could look at her and look at her innocence when she's 11 now. But I used to take her to the grocery store, of course, and she'd sit in the cart and would push her around, and she would wave to anyone that passed her. Because why wouldn't she? In her world, everyone is a friend. But us poor adults, no, we're afraid of each other, aren't we? We're terrified of each other. And so she'd wave at people, and people like, and what would I do? What do I say? I say, sorry. But to her and to the child, the idealized child, everyone is a friend, and we are open to each other. And of course, we love the simplicity of children as well. I used to work at the Unity People's Convention every year. Actually, I know Erin McCabe, and it's one of the places I met Reverend Debris as well. And actually, Sophia would come with me every now and then, and I would do sound healing for anyone that cared. And that's how I'd meet people. But anyway, well, it's on one of these occasions, a minister from South Texas, he came and sat down, and Sophia was with me. And Sophia goes to him and says, "Who are you?" And he says, "I am a Unity minister." And Sophia said, "What's that?" And he goes, it's an institution that recognizes all people, all faiths, all cultures, and socioeconomic status. Yeah. And Sophia was like, okay then. I disagree with him. I think unity is a place where people are either happy or they're trying to be happy. Just saying. But he shouldn't have said that. He should have said, "My name is Gary and I like chocolate." And then they would have talked to each other. His name is Gary and he does like chocolate. Just saying, talking the truth here. I'm sure some of you, like myself, you own an iPhone, right? Now, back in the day, I'm old enough to remember when those came out, and even before, when they had things called iPods. But even before that, there were things called MP3 players. Do you remember that? Right. And so, back in the day, people would talk about bit rates, compression ratios, Gorilla Glass, and none of this shit that I understand, right? And then one day, Steve Jobs stands up in front of us and holds up this thing and says, "This is insanely cool." And I'm like, I understand that. And I got one. And I have been an Apple mug ever since. Because I understand it, because it's not overcomplicated. Because why do we overcomplicate things? It's because it makes us feel significant. It brings us value and some kind of synthetic worth, which is not true worth. But children don't need to do that. They don't need to overcomplicate. They just understand what they understand, or they don't. I haven't told you about my other kids yet. I have 2 boys who are currently, no, he's not 7 yet, he's almost 7, 6 and 9. So I know what a tantrum looks like. And more importantly, I know how long a tantrum lasts for. Because you know what children do that we don't do, is they fully feel. And when you fully feel, and I can look at this from a metaphysical perspective, this is what I do, when you fully feel, you release, which means you don't have the dregs of what you've been holding on to. Because us lot, we're like, well, that thing Sally did 19 years ago, and we'd still remember it, we'd still resent for it. But children will fully feel, fully release, move on. And that's why children can get upset, but they won't be angry the next day. They won't be holding on to it the next day. It's gone. And we can learn a lot from that, a tremendous amount from that. Do you know, I do need to look at this, I apologize. Yeah, let's talk about my boys a little bit more. And their incessant focus. You know, my youngest Alexander, you know, when he wants a glass of water, the whole house knows about it. There he goes. Oh, we're good, we're good. The whole house knows about it. Eden is my middle, and he builds Lego. And when he can't find a piece of Lego, the whole street knows about it. Now, can you imagine if you wanted God like that? You wouldn't need to be here, that's for sure. A teacher who I never got to meet, he's actually one of my teachers' teachers, if that makes sense. A teacher called Hilda Charlton. She used to live and teach in New York City. She was a student of Barber. Wonderful, wonderful person. And she would talk about the distinction, the difference between wanting God and wanting to want God. And I would put myself, and respectfully everyone else in this room, in the latter category. But it's not just about God, you see. You see, if there's something you're wanting to call into your life, and it's not here yet, you don't want it. You want to want it. Because if you wanted it, you would have it. Such is the application, the expression of our conscious will. We get what we want if we really, really want it. And so my kids, when they want a glass of water, they sure as hell get it. They sure get it. You know, it is a privilege these days, you know, especially as we get a little older, to see things for the first time. And I remember when I saw the Grand Canyon for the first time. I was 31, that was years ago. And I remember seeing it, and I was a Brit, remember. I'm from England. You don't get Grand Canyons in England. You get like dirty ditches and stuff. But no Grand Canyons, no. And I remember seeing this thing, and it was early in the morning as well. I saw this phenomenon that took up my whole field of vision. It was incredible to have that feeling, something you haven't seen before. And by the way, I think we're going to have it in a few weeks' time when the Avatar movie comes out. I think it's going to be that good. It's going to be that good. But that is the way of children, isn't it? And there's some fun stories about this, aren't there? As a child who was in school, in class, was painting. And the teacher noticed this because the child doesn't usually paint. And so the teacher goes to the child and says, well, what are you painting? What are you drawing? And the child says, I'm drawing God. And the teacher says, well, no one knows what God looks like. And the child says, well, wait 5 minutes and they will. And there's the child that, the teacher goes to the child, another child, and says, well, how old's your father? And the child says, 6. And the teacher says, well, your father is not 6. And the child says, I'm 6, and he became a father when I was born. And don't you love how that makes sense? It makes complete sense, doesn't it? Now, this is all cute and adorable, I'm sure, but we need to reflect that at least 5 years, and certainly 10 years, most or a lot of the businesses that you depend on didn't exist then. Oh, we were talking about Zoom a minute ago, weren't we? I mean, YouTube's barely over, YouTube is barely over 10 years old itself. And we're living in a world where this is going to get more and more normal. And so it behooves us, never mind kingdom of heaven right now, let's deal with our own area. It behooves us to look at a world and a future that we don't know yet exists, to look at it with fresh and clear and open eyes. Now, obviously, I'm idealizing the child state, because it's not all like that. I've mentioned tantrums already. And if we are to be as children to enter the kingdom of heaven, well then I need to balance it with Corinthians. See, I'm a fan of Corinthians. We're a fan of lots of passages in the Bible there. That's good. There's no jealousy, I'm sure. Corinthians 13:11, which reminds us that when I was a child, I spoke as a child, I thought as a child, I behaved as a child. But now I'm an adult, and I think as an adult, behave as an adult. I conduct myself as an adult. So clearly there, even in the Bible, there's some cognizance that there's a bit more to it, and some discipline and boundaries are needed in there. Because I love all my children very, very much, very, very much. And I know in the span of a given day, there will probably be a little trouble sharing. I imagine one of the boys will, at least once in the day, hit the other one, and the other one will hit the first one, because you've got to balance it out, right? Now, I hope to God that no one in the room is being hit by anyone. I hope very much that is not the case. And yet, we're all often hitting one another with our words, hitting one another with our energy, if you could really see it, what comes out of our solar plexus. Maybe a little late in the day to tell you this, but I'm actually Jewish. And I grew up with the Old Testament. I went to a Christian school, which is great because we got to discover the Forbidden Testament, the New Testament. But in the Old Testament, we meet Samson and Delilah. Do you remember that story? Samson and Delilah. For me, the best part of the whole Old Testament. Samson, he's like the Iron Man or the Incredible Hulk of the Old Testament. This guy who never cuts his hair, eats food out of a dead animal, and can beat anyone in a fight. Because in England, everyone's got a friend like that. And what you do, you see, is you send them into the pub first. And you make sure everything's okay, and then you go in. And the story of Samson almost begins with God speaking to him and saying, "You are the one that will lead my people to freedom." And from that point on, Samson habitually doesn't listen to that. From what I understand, he's a little more interested in his stomach and another part of his body, which I'm not going to mention in church. And then we meet him after all that, at the end, and he's in chains and he's blind. This is the end of his life. And God speaks to him again and says, "You are the one that will lead my people to freedom." And I'm sure you know how the story ends. He calls forth the power of God and his superhuman strength through himself and brings down the building, defeats those who are holding him captive, and he frees his people. And if that had been the 500th time that God had spoken to him and said the same thing, at that time God loved him no less and no more than the first time. For even as children of God that we are that don't listen, and we need to hear it 500 times, God is not keeping count. So I've got a question for you all. I want to see hands. If you know that it tastes gross if you brush your teeth and then you drink orange juice straight away afterwards, who knows that? Let's see hands. Okay, that's about half of you. Do you know why you know that? Because you've done it like 70 times. And we are fascinating creatures, aren't we? Like, what was up with the last 69 times? So brush, 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 glug, glug. Oh, yeah. I'm sure some of you have learned to ride a bicycle, as I have. And you probably learned how I learned, which is my father, actually, holding the saddle behind me, and I'm cycling. And then at one point, I turn around, he's not there. And I'm riding a bike. And that's it. Now, perhaps like me, you fell off and hit your chin. But also, if you did that, perhaps like me, you got on the bicycle again and realized you could ride the bicycle. But what happens in there? There's a moment of abject terror, isn't it? When you realize there's no one holding the saddle. But it's a transient and it's a temporary abject terror. And that's what we grown up children of God forget. That when we're in our car, it is a moment. But time is relative in those times, and we forget that. We think that is the destination, but it's not. It's a station on the way. But we're reminded to consider the kingdom of heaven, right? Before about 1:30 this morning, I would have started wrapping this talk up around now. Something interesting happened. In the first version of this talk, around about the time when I told you I was Jewish, I'm going to be honest with you, I was going to throw a teeny-weeny little joke in about Kanye West. But I got reminded about 1:30 in the morning from that which guides us all. They said to me, remember what you're talking to them about. The voice said, you're talking to them about children of God, so why would you make fun of one of them? They said to me, did you like being made fun of when you were a child? And I'm like, no, I didn't. And I thought about Kanye. I'm not a huge fan of his music, to be honest. But I thought about him as a man. And him right now, there's a divorced guy feeling more pain than he's able to, and he's struggling immensely. I don't support what he's saying, but I see someone in pain. And I didn't, in that moment, need to pray for him because I already was. Matthew 18:13, you must be as children to enter the kingdom of heaven. But there's a word in there that usually gets missed. And it is that we must be converted to be as children of God. Now, there's a word that's got badly misunderstood. Because the assumption is that there's got to be external conversion. No, the conversion is internal. It's internal. I'm going to pause. My hesitation is, where am I getting this from? I'm getting it Paramahansa Yogananda is who speaks beautifully about this. The conversion is a state of vibration. It's a state of being. Because the kingdom of heaven is always there. The Christ consciousness is always there. This is a conversation about opening up to that. What do we have to do? Why are we shut down? What are we in fear about? We have to convert our state of being from fear, from constriction, to love and joy, openness and receptivity. From the left brain to the right brain, if you're into that sort of thing. There's an author, his name is Gay Hendricks. He wrote a wonderful book called The Big Leap. It's really good. And he tells a story in that, because he never knew his physical father. His father died when he was a few months old. He tells a story, he was at church on a Sunday like this in Alabama, where he'd be learning all about the Son of God. And so he goes out into the Alabama sunshine after that, and he's looking up at the sun through the trees. And he's looking up and he thinks, well, my father is not down here, so my father must be up there. And he thinks, well, that's where God is. And if my father is up there, then maybe I am the Son of God. And he pauses and thinks, and if I am the Son of God, then maybe everyone else is. And if everyone else is, then we are all connected. And he's 5 years old, coming to that conclusion, coming to that reality. The disease in our world and our culture is separation, and it is division. You can pretty much boil it down to that. Do you know, I'm not looking for an answer, I'm being rhetorical. Do you know it is in your hands and in your mind and in your heart to choose against that, to actually choose unity? To choose not to close down, to choose not to shut your heart down. Do you know how much you can change when you do that? We don't talk about the Christ consciousness right now because it's Christmas. It's Christmas because there's a greater availability of the Christ consciousness at this time of year. That's why all this stuff is around. That's why people are being generally nicer to each other. Now, I've talked for a long time. I'm going to wrap this up now. But I offer you these three little words, children of God, as a contemplation. As you go into this next week, and the week after, where people are generally happier, to see yourself as such. To make it easier to forgive yourself, should you need to. Should you want to. So that you can be his peace. And finish this with me. Blessed be the peacemakers, for they shall be known as... Thank you so much.